Dorsey's radical workforce reset may embolden CEOs, written by Dan Primack, published by Axios. It was only a matter of time before a future-thinking CEO took the leap and replaced thousands of workers with AI. Block's Jack Dorsey did just that Thursday, and Wall Street's standing ovation gives other CEOs permission, or even an incentive, to consider the same thing. What he's saying: Dorsey, an iconoclast who co-founded and once led Twitter, was blunt in announcing via X that Block will say goodbye to 40% of its 10,000-person workforce. Something has changed. We're already seeing that the intelligence tools we're creating and using, paired with smaller and flatter teams, are enabling a new way of working which fundamentally changes what it means to build and run a company, he wrote. I had two options: cut gradually over months or years as this shift plays out, or be honest about where we are and act on it now. I chose the latter. The fintech stock rallied as much as 25% on the news after having been down more than 16% over the past year and 76% over the past 5 years. Block's declining stock price put Dorsey under pressure to make changes, although he denied that the layoffs were related to Block's financial performance. The big picture is, Wall Street was recently captivated by a viral doomsday report predicting AI would wipe out jobs, although stated reasons for most other AI-related layoffs so far have been less explicit than what Dorsey said. Many AI executives and investors insist that the tech will lead to temporary labor dislocations rather than net job loss, echoing the Industrial Revolution. The bottom line is, it's one thing to replace people with machines, it's quite another to prove that it makes business sense. If Block can grow its top line with a much smaller headcount, the rest of corporate America will take notice. Danish Prime Minister calls snap election amid Greenland momentum, written by Roshni Majumdar, published by DW. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen on Thursday announced snap parliamentary elections on March 24th. It comes as their party sees an urge in its popularity after she pushed back against U.S. President Donald Trump's aggressive bid to acquire the Danish territory of Greenland. A general election must be held in the country at least every 4 years, but the Prime Minister of the NATO and European Union member country can call one at any time. The last election was held on November 1st, 2022, and resulted in a three-party coalition that crosses the left-right divide. What did Denmark's Frederiksen say about the snap election? This will be a decisive election, because it will be in the next 4 years that we as Danes and as Europeans will really have to stand on our own feet, Frederiksen said. We need to define a relationship with the United States, and we must rearm to ensure peace on our continent, she added. We must stick together with Europe, and we must secure the future of the Danish Commonwealth, she said, referring to the Danish kingdom that consists of Denmark, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. Mette Frederiksen has earned recognition at home and on the global political stage for her efforts to push back against President Trump's efforts to acquire the semi-autonomous Danish territory. Her efforts to do so have bolstered her popularity in recent months, opinion polls suggest, after public dissatisfaction over rising living costs and pressures on welfare services. The U.S. has a military base on the island and stationed thousands of troops during the Cold War before Washington pulled them away from the Arctic island. The Trump administration has argued that having more control over Greenland was crucial to national security. In January, Danes expressed their annoyance with the plan, having taken to the streets in large numbers in downtown Copenhagen to protest U.S. plans. The Trump administration appears to have eased on its threats to acquire it for now, though the U.S. president spoke at length about his desire to control the island during Munich's security conference earlier this month. Many said that that left a bitter taste in the mouths of many European officials present at the security gathering. In January, European nations, including Germany, also sent a smaller number of troops to the island in a show of solidarity. Denmark also boosted their presence on the Arctic island. Days ago, Trump declared he would send a great hospital boat to the Arctic island that would take care of the many people who are sick. Denmark has since rejected the offer. With only 3 women left, an Amazon tribe faced extinction. An unexpected birth now brings hope. Written by Gabriela C. Pessoa, published by AP. Sao Paulo. Pagopia and her daughters Iga and Babwaru lived for years as the only surviving members of the Ankutsu, an indigenous people decimated by a government-backed push to develop parts of the Amazon rainforest. As they advanced in age without a child to carry on the line, many expected the Ankutsu to vanish when the woman died. That changed in December when Babaru, the youngest of the three, in her 40s, gave birth to a boy. Akyep's arrival brought hope not just for the Ankutsu line, but also for efforts to protect the equally fragile rainforest. This child is not only a symbol of the resistance of the Ankutsu people, but also a source of hope for indigenous peoples, said Joina Wapichana, president of Brazil's Indigenous Protection Agency, known as FUNAI. He represents how recognition, protection, and the management of this land are extremely necessary. Protecting indigenous territories is widely seen as one of the most effective ways to curb deforestation in the Amazon, the world's largest rainforest and a key regulator of global climate. Researchers warned that continued forest loss could accelerate global warming. A 2022 analysis by Map Biomass, a network of non-governmental groups tracking land use, found indigenous territories in Brazil had lost just 1% of native vegetation over 3 decades, compared with 20% on private land nationwide. In Rondônia State, where the Ankutsu dwell, about 40% of native forest has been cleared, and what remains untouched is largely within conservation and indigenous areas. The Ankutsu's land stands out in satellite images as an island of forest surrounded by cattle pasture, as well as soy and cornfields. In the 1980s, deforestation pushed attacks in Rondônia. Rondônia's deforestation traces back to a government-backed push to occupy the rainforest during Brazil's military regime in the 1970s. Around the same time, an infrastructure program financed in part by the World Bank promoted domestic migration to the Amazon, including the paving of a way across the state. In the 1980s, Rondônia's population more than doubled, according to census data. The settlers were promised land titles if they cleared the forest for agriculture, and risked losing claims if indigenous people were present, fueling violent attacks by hired gunmen on indigenous groups such as the Ankutsu. FUNAI made first contact with the Ankutsu in 1995, finding 7 survivors. Experts believe they had numbered about 20 a decade earlier, when they were attacked by ranchers seeking to occupy the area. FUNAI agents found evidence of the assault, and when they contacted the Ankutsu, the survivors recounted what happened. Some still bore gunshot wounds. The last Ankutsu man died in 2017. Since then, Babaru lived with her mother, Pugapia, and Iga, her sister. The women, whose ages aren't known for certain, have chosen to remain isolated from the non-indigenous world, showing little interest in it. In 2006, FUNAI granted territorial protection to the Ankutsu, establishing the Rio Omere indigenous land, which they have since shared with the Kano people. The two groups, once enemies, began maintaining contact, usually mediated by officials. The relationship is complex, with cooperation, but also cultural differences and language barriers. The Associated Press requested a facilitated interview with the women through FUNAI, but the agency didn't respond. Amanda Villa, an anthropologist with the Observatory of Isolated Peoples, said Ankutsu women depend on Kano men for tasks considered masculine, such as hunting and clearing fields. The two groups have also exchanged spiritual knowledge. The current Kano spiritual leader, for example, learned from the late Ankutsu patriarch. But the most consequential development for the future of the Ankutsu may have occurred last year, when Babaru became pregnant by a Kano man. Linguist Carolina Aragon is the only outsider able to communicate with the 3 women after years studying and documenting their language. She works closely with FUNAI, translating conversations almost daily through video calls. Aragon also supported Babaru remotely during her labor and was with her during an ultrasound exam that confirmed the pregnancy. Aragon said Babaru was stunned by the news. She said, "How can I be pregnant?" Aragon recalled. Babaru had always taken precautions to avoid becoming pregnant. The surviving Ankutsu woman had decided they would not become mothers. The decision was driven not only by the absence of other men in their community, but also by the belief that their world was disorganized, conditions they felt were not suitable for raising a child. "You can trace this decision directly to the violent context they lived through," said Vela, the anthropologist. "They have this somewhat catastrophic understanding. The Ankutsu believed they could not bring a new life into a world without Ankutsu men who could not only perform, but also teach tasks the group considers male responsibilities, such as hunting and shamanism. A breakdown of social relations that followed the genocide shaped their lives and deepened over the years. That does lead people to think and rethink the future, Aragon said, but the future can surprise everyone. A baby boy was born. Aragon said the women were embarking on a new chapter, choosing to welcome the child and adapt their traditions with support from the Kano and Funai. Villa said the fact that the newborn is a boy creates the possibility of restoring male roles like Hunter. Researchers and officials who have long worked with the three women understood that protecting the territory depended on the Ankutsu's survival as a people. They sought to avoid a repeat of what happened to Tanaru, an indigenous man who was discovered after living alone and without contact for decades. After the discovery, authorities struggled to protect Tanaru's territory. After he died in 2022, non-indigenous groups began disputing the land. Late last year, the federal government finally secured the area, turning it into a protected conservation unit. Funai's Wapachana and Babaru's child is a hope that this next generation will indeed include an indigenous person, an Ankatsu, ensuring the continuity of this people. Through years of careful work, Funai secured territorial protection for the Ankutsu and helped foster ties with the Kano. The agency also arranged spiritual support from an allied shaman, allowing the women to feel safe bringing new life into the world after decades of fear and loss. The Ankutsu form emotional bonds with the forest and with the birds. Now they are strengthening those bonds with a new human life in their world. What kind of relationship will this boy have with his own territory, Aragon said. I hope it will be the best possible, because he has everything he needs there. U.S. urges its citizens to leave Israel immediately amid strike to threat to Iran. Written by somebody, published by The Guardian. The U.S. has authorized the departure of non-essential government workers and their families from Israel as the threat of an American strike on Iran looms. U.S. citizens should consider leaving Israel while commercial flights are available, the Department of State advisory added. It also urged against travel to Israel. The warning came after talks between the U.S. and Iran over the future of Tehran's nuclear program ended inconclusively, with the suggestion that further discussions would be held next week. Donald Trump has assembled 2 carrier strike groups ready to attack if he believes Tehran is not serious about ending its nuclear activities. The Department of State warning has supplemented by a message to U.S. Embassy staff from the ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, urging those that wanted to leave to do so today. Huckabee contacted embassy staff in an email sent at 12:04 a.m. local time, urging them to book flights anywhere they could. This move will likely result in high demand for airline seats today, he wrote. Focus on getting a seat to any place from which you can, then continue travel to D.C. But the first priority will be getting expeditiously out of the country. The UK said on Friday it had temporarily withdrawn its staff from Iran, citing the security situation in the region. The foreign officer said its ability to assist British nationals was now extremely limited, with the embassy operating remotely and no in-person consular support available, even in emergencies. The U.S. call to leave Israel came as Oman's foreign minister, Badr al-Busadi, the key mediator in the talks between the U.S. and Iran, flew to Washington in what looked increasingly like a last-ditch effort to persuade the Trump administration to hold back. He was due to brief J.D. Vance, the U.S. vice president, and make the case that enough progress has been made in the talks to warrant caution. The urgency of his visit, hours after talks between Iran and the U.S. ended in Geneva on Thursday evening, suggested he believed he needed to act quickly to counter those making the case for a military intervention. In a sign that large gaps exist between the two sides, the Iranian leadership called on the U.S. to drop its toughest demands. The U.S. negotiators, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, ominously issued no statement after the talks. Vance is reputedly the senior member of the administration most opposed to military interventions, and al-Busadi's task is to try to convince him that a swift military strike will not change Iran's basic negotiating stance. However, the U.S. State Department has formally announced that Marco Rubio will travel to Israel for meetings earlier next week. It is unlikely Israel or the U.S. would launch a strike on Iran while Rubio is in Israel because of the expectation of an Iranian counterattack on the country. Rubio is expected to meet Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu along with other senior Israeli officials. Rubio will travel to Israel on Monday and Tuesday, but in a rare departure from previous trips, will not be taking reporters with him. The State Department did not specify why reporters would not be on the trip. The Secretary will discuss a range of regional priorities including Iran, Lebanon, and ongoing efforts to implement President Trump's 20-point peace plan for Gaza, said Tommy Pigott, the principal deputy spokesperson for the U.S. State Department. The State Department denied reports that U.S. embassies in Iraq and Kuwait had received orders for the evacuation of non-essential personnel. The reports of the evacuations, strenuously denied by U.S. officials on Friday, were seen as another indication that the U.S. was preparing an imminent strike against Iran. In an interview with the Washington Post, Vance said he did not know whether Trump would back a military strike, but said the U.S. could engage in limited strikes in the region without ending up in a forever war. I do think we have to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, Vance said. I also think we have to avoid overlearning the lessons of the past. Just because one president screwed up a military conflict doesn't mean we can never engage in military conflict again. We've got to be careful about it, but I think the president is being careful, he added. Iran has held out against Washington's demand to export its highly enriched uranium stockpile to the U.S. and says it is not willing to end altogether its right to enrich uranium domestically. The Iranian parliament has passed a law last July that banned cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and required a recognition of Iran's right to enrich before inspectors could return. In a report for an IAEA board meeting next week, officials confirmed they had no knowledge of the whereabouts of the 400 kilogram of highly enriched uranium inside Iran, adding, "It is crucial to have access without delay." The report said it was particularly disturbing that the IAEA had never had access to an enrichment facility in Isfahan, which has declared for the first time in June. The IAEA also reported that through the analysis of commercially available satellite imagery, it had observed activities being conducted at some of the affected nuclear facilities, including the enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordow, but added that without access to these facilities, it is not possible for the agency to confirm the nature and the purpose of the activities. Iran has said it would commit to needs-based enrichment and for now would require only 20% or lower purity levels at its Tehran research reactor. The fuel for this reactor comes from Russia. The site mainly makes medical isotopes used to diagnose illnesses such as heart disease. Iran's 3 main nuclear facilities were destroyed by U.S. bombing last June. Iran also has a largely Russian-built facility in Bushehr on the Gulf Coast. The first civilian nuclear power plant in the Middle East, it is also supplied with Russian fuel. The separate issue of its 400 kilogram stockpile of highly enriched uranium at 60% could be addressed by diluting or downblending it, as happened under the 2015 nuclear agreement. The two sides are scheduled to meet next week at technical level in Vienna at the headquarters of the IAEA, the UN-affiliated body that would be required to verify Iranian compliance. World reacts to eruption of fighting between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Written by Al Jazeera staff and published by Al Jazeera. Pakistan has said it is now in open war with Afghanistan's Taliban government as explosions were reported in Kabul and fighting continues in other locations along the border. Pakistan says it has attacked Kandahar and Paktika inside Afghanistan. The declaration on Friday comes hours after Taliban spokesperson Zabihullah Mujahid said Afghanistan was carrying out large-scale offensive operations against the Pakistani military along the Durand Line, which separates the two countries. The Taliban said its attack was in response to a separate round of Pakistani airstrikes earlier this week. Here's how countries and institutions are reacting. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is closely monitoring the situation, expressing deep concern over the surge in violence. In a statement delivered by his spokesperson, Stéphane Dujarric, Guterres urged both nations to adhere strictly to their obligations under international law, with a specific emphasis on international humanitarian law. Gutierrez underscored the urgent need for both parties to prioritize the protection of civilians as confrontations continue. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, who has been involved in intensive talks with the United Nations to avert conflict engulfing his own nation, has urged the two countries to resolve their differences through dialogue and good neighborly principles, as he highlighted the significance of the holy month of Ramadan as a time for self-restraint and Islamic solidarity. In a post on X earlier Friday, Araghchi reaffirmed Iran's readiness to support the process, stating his country is prepared to provide any necessary assistance to facilitate constructive dialogue, deepen mutual understanding, and promote cooperation between Kabul and Islamabad. Russia has urged the warring parties to halt cross-border attacks immediately and resolve their differences through diplomatic means. The RIA news agency reported on Friday, citing the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Russia has also offered to mediate if both sides agree. The country's foreign ministry spokesperson Ranhir Jaswal said India strongly condemns Pakistan's airstrikes, noting that they took place during the holy month of Ramadan. It is another attempt by Pakistan to externalize its internal failures, Jaswal said in a statement on X. India has strengthened ties with the Taliban recently, and Islamabad accuses New Delhi of funding groups in Afghanistan and in Pakistan itself to undermine Pakistan's security, which India denies. A Turkish diplomatic source told the Reuters news agency that Hakan Fidan, Turkey's top diplomat, held discussions on the ongoing conflict in separate calls with foreign ministers from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Abdulaziz Al Khalafi, the Qatari Minister of State at the Foreign Ministry, held a phone call with Pakistani Foreign Minister Mohammad Ishaq Dar. A State Department of the Qatari Foreign Ministry said that the sides discussed the ways to de-escalate tensions between Pakistan and Afghanistan in a manner that enhances security and stability in the region. Beijing is deeply concerned over the escalation along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said on Friday, China has been mediating the conflict through its own channels, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning said during a regular news conference. China is willing to play a constructive role in cooling the situation, she added. Britain's Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper posted on X that the UK is deeply concerned by the significant escalation in tensions between Afghanistan and Pakistan. We urge both sides to take immediate steps toward de-escalation, avoid further harm to civilians, and re-engage in mediated dialogue. In addition to blaming the Taliban for terrorism and instability within the country, Pakistan's Defense Minister Khawaja Asif says Islamabad made every effort, both directly and through friendly countries, to keep the situation stable. It carried out extensive diplomacy. Today, when attempts are being made to target Pakistan with aggression, by the grace of God, our armed forces are giving a decisive response, he said on X. Our patience has reached its limit. Now it is open war. Now there will be decisive action. Former Afghanistan President Hamid Karzai says the country will defend its beloved homeland with complete unity in all circumstances and will respond to aggression with courage, said Pakistan's attacks. Pakistan cannot free itself from the violence and bombings, those problems it has created itself, but must change its own policy and choose the path of good neighborliness, respect, and civilized relations with Afghanistan, he said on X. Incoherent, Hegseth's Anthropic Ultimatum Confounds AI Policymakers. Written by Brendan Bordeleon, published by Politico. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's ultimatum to the artificial intelligence startup Anthropic is sparking shock and confusion among lawyers and AI policymakers, who accuse the Pentagon of making contradictory threats as it pressures the company to lift restrictions on the use of its powerful AI model. Hegseth met with Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei on Tuesday to deliver a warning. Give the military unfettered access to its Claude AI model by Friday evening, or else have the government label it a risk to the supply chain. The designation, typically reserved for foreign firms with ties to U.S. adversaries, could ban companies that work with the government from partnering with Anthropic. But Hegseth simultaneously threatened to invoke the Cold War-era Defense Production Act to compel Anthropic to work with the Defense Department and nix the company's ethical red lines, which include restrictions on using Claude to surveil U.S. citizens or empower autonomous weapons. The government used the law during the COVID-19 pandemic to accelerate production of medical supplies and vaccines. Dean Ball, a former AI advisor in the Trump administration, said the Pentagon is contradicting itself by forcing Anthropic to cooperate with the government even as it moves to label the company a security risk. Quote, "You're telling everyone else who supplies to the DoD you cannot use Anthropic's models, while also saying that the DoD must use Anthropic's models," said Ball, who was the lead author of the White House's AI action plan. He called it incoherent to even float the two policy ideas together, and a whole different level of insane to move up and say we're going to do both of those things. It doesn't make any sense, said Ball. The high-stakes standoff has its roots in the January operation to capture former Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. The U.S. military used Anthropic's Claude AI model in the raid. The Wall Street Journal reported, prompting Anthropic to ask its corporate partner, Palantir, about the use of its product. Hegseth and the other Pentagon officials bristled at those questions, eventually summoning Modi to deliver the week's ultimatum. Last summer, Anthropic, along with its corporate rivals OpenAI, Google, and xAI, signed a $200 million contract with the Pentagon. In a January speech at SpaceX headquarters, a company owned by tech billionaire and xAI CEO Elon Musk, Hegseth declared that the DoD's artificial intelligence will not be woke and will operate without ideological constraints that limit lawful military applications. The comment was widely viewed as a shot at Anthropic, particularly since White House AI czar David Sachs has repeatedly criticized the company. In a statement to Politico, DoD spokesperson Sean Parnell confirmed that the department's relationship with Anthropic is being reviewed. "Our nation requires that our partners be willing to help our warfighters win in any fight," said Parnell. "Ultimately, this is about our troops and the safety of the American people." On Wednesday, Axios reported that the DoD has asked two top defense contractors to assess their use of Anthropic's model as a step toward designating the company with the supply chain risk. A Pentagon official said Tuesday that the department plans to both label Anthropic a supply chain risk and invoke the DPA to compel it to work with the DoD unless it accedes to demands by Friday. A Pentagon spokesperson declined to comment on further questions about the strategy, including its alleged incoherence. But Katie Sweeten, a tech lawyer and former Department of Justice official who served as the agency's point of contact with the Pentagon, also called the DoD's arguments contradictory. "I don't know how you can both use the DPA to take over this product and also at the same time say this product is a massive national security risk," said Sweeten. She warned that Hegseth's very aggressive negotiating posture could have a chilling effect on partnerships between the Pentagon and Silicon Valley. "This is about the heaviest-handed way you can regulate a business," said Sweeten, calling it a landmark moment with how the Department of Defense interacts with our cutting-edge technology developed on U.S. soil. During the Biden era, some conservatives objected to the Democratic president's use of the DPA to force AI companies to share data on cutting-edge models. This time, voices from across the political spectrum are already decrying the Pentagon's proposed use of the law to require a private company to lift restrictions on the use of its product. In a Wednesday statement, Senators Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, and Andy Kim, Democrat from New Jersey, criticized the administration's threat to use the Defense Production Act and warned it would shatter the bipartisan consensus in support of the statute. On the other side of the aisle, Neil Chilson, head of AI policy at the Koch-affiliated Abundance Institute, warned that the Korean War-era emergency statute should not be used to expand executive power. Chilson called on Congress to change the law. On Tuesday, Modi reiterated his red lines on surveillance and autonomous weapons to Hegseth. An Anthropic spokesperson did not respond when asked whether the company will submit to the Pentagon's demands, whether Anthropic plans to sue the Pentagon if it carries out its threats, or if the DoD wants to use Claude to surveil U.S. citizens or deploy weapons without humans in the loop. A Pentagon official granted an anonymity to discuss sensitive talks said in a statement that a standoff with Anthropic has nothing to do with mass surveillance and autonomous weapons being used. The DoD official said other AI companies, including OpenAI, Google, and xAI, are working collaboratively with the Pentagon in good faith to ensure their models can be used for all lawful purposes. The official confirmed to Politico that xAI has agreed to allow its AI model Grok to be used in a classified setting, and that OpenAI and Google are close. It is unclear whether the other AI firms have agreed to allow the Pentagon to use their models to surveil U.S. citizens or empower autonomous weapons. Spokesperson for OpenAI, Google, and xAI did not respond to questions on the subject. Both suggested the Pentagon is standing on principle and is not actually interested in crossing Anthropic's red lines on surveillance and autonomous weaponry. But Sweeten said it's tough to understand why the Pentagon has launched such an unprecedented campaign against a U.S. tech company, unless it has a strong interest in using its tools in ways that Anthropic hopes to forbid. If these are the lines in the sand that the DoD is drawing, I would assume that one or both of those functions are scenarios that they would want to utilize this for, said Sweeten.